Hello,
Tiny.
my name is Daniel Simon. We are having the 10th anniversary of the anthology Business Architecture Management Architecting the Business for Consistency and Alignment this year. As the editor of the book, now that it's 10 years later, I'm revisiting some chapters with their contributors, well, to reflect a little and also look at how things might have further evolved since then. Today, I do have the pleasure of having a conversation with Tom Graves, a true legend in the architecture field, someone who has given so much that has helped many architecture practitioners across the globe, well, to make an impact in their organizations. So, welcome, Tom. It's an honor to have you here today. Many thanks for
Thank you.
taking the
Yeah,
time to have a chat with me.
yeah. I always wonder if I actually, if what I do is actually of any use. So it's really nice to know that people seem to value it.
Well, it certainly is.
Okay, great.
First of all, Tom, would you mind sharing a few highlights about you, who you are, what you've been doing over the years, and so on? Just a very quick intro. How would you describe
Sure.
yourself?
I suppose my real field is how people learn skills. That's been my work for 50 years or more. And I have so much as you might say, I've careered around that space with things like, was one of the people who invented desktop publishing, that kind of stuff. So I've been bouncing in and out of somewhat of the IT, but I have to keep trying to remind people that the IT is about that much and the rest is about people,
Mhm,
which particularly applies to business architecture.
mhm,
So for the last 20 years, I suppose, I've been really focusing on enterprise architecture and trying to get people to focus on the enterprise as something more than just a certain type of business,
mhm,
but instead is actually the story in the shared story in which your organization operates.
mhm,
So in the most recent book I've been doing, which I finished yesterday, um, we've been using an airport as an example of what is the
uh-huh,
enterprise of air travel in which your enterprise operates and who are the other players in that story.
mhm,
So that's the kind of thing I've been working on. Um,
mhm.
so it comes back to, I think, your questions, which you had here about business architecture and small to medium enterprises.
Yeah, let me maybe
Yeah, yeah,
start with
sure.
this one to
Mhm, sure.
well, to refine this a little at the very beginning. So your chapter that you contributed to the book,
Mhm.
yeah, was all about this, yeah,
Yes.
using business architecture in small to medium enterprises. So
Yeah.
why is business architecture not just something for large, but also for smaller organizations? I'm quite often asked how large an organization needs to be, well, for business architecture and also enterprise architecture to become something that, let's say, should or needs to be dealt with or practiced. And I guess you had to deal with questions like this in the
Mm,
past too, right? So
mm.
what's your answer? In what way and to what degree can small to medium enterprises benefit from business architecture and enterprise architecture alike?
Right. So smallest size is a one-man band, right? In fact, one of the things that particularly got me going on this recent work was a colleague who came to me with, he said he'd done his SWOT analysis and he'd done his business model canvas for his one man. What is does exhibition design or CGI generally for various clients,
Mhm,
and he does odd stuff like how do you visualize a nuclear reaction, that kind of stuff.
mhm,
So he said, "How do I do this? What do I do? What is my business model?" And he's a one man band, and all of this stuff applies directly to his work.
mhm,
So that's the smallest one is a part-time job for one person.
mhm,
What are you trying to do? What is your business? Where are you positioning it? What is the story you're inside? How do you need to what do you need to do to make it work? How do you assess whether you're effective and so on? These are straightforward business architecture questions.
mhm,
They apply as much at that scale as they do to a global multinational.
mhm,
So the point is that the techniques that we use are actually the same all the way through. We
mhm,
plug in different bits to
mhm,
apply to things like scale, complexity, and so on. But the core practice is still essentially the same, whatever you're doing.
mhm,
It's what the heck business am I in? What are my services that I need to assemble? How am I going to put, what am I, setting out my stall? What is my products and services going to be? How is the real world responding to what I've put out there? And how do I deal with, good afternoon, this is chaos department?
Mhm.
Um, like, for example, a certain person has introduced a random collection of tariffs across the whole world.
Mhm.
How do you deal with that when suddenly your business model is forced to change in a hurry? A lot of people had to do urgent changes to their business model with COVID hitting, for
Yeah.
example. So
Yeah.
every business still has all of these issues. It's just the next bit is just scale.
Yeah.
And when you have scale, you've got complexity as well.
Yeah.
So those bits add, but the fundamentals still apply right
Mhm.
down to a single person.
Mhm. So, given what you just described, Tom, if we look at the role of the business architect and the enterprise architect alike, yeah,
Mhm.
whether it's in a small to medium or large organization, what would you say are sort of the most important skills, competencies, and traits of a business architect or an enterprise architect? What belongs to what matters most to make an impact as an architecture practitioner?
Well, the first one is to be able to do architecture.
Mhm.
And that's to be able to think in terms of how does the whole big picture work in relation to all the individual little bits working. And design is always looking down towards making something real. Architecture is always looking up to how does this connect with the big picture? How does this connect across the whole? So a solution, you develop the skills through doing things like solution architecture or whatever. Business architecture suffered for a long time with a complete misnomer, which was with the people who called themselves enterprise architects, who were basically IT architects, defining business architecture as anything not IT that might affect IT, which
Mhm.
wasn't actually very helpful to people trying to do the architecture of the business.
Mhm.
But that's where things got a bit lost for a while. But the principles, the things you really need is to think architecturally, which is how do my little bits connect. Actually, a useful metaphor you could play with is boxes, lines, and glue.
Mhm.
A lot of people have the familiarity with, okay, start again. Classic scientific management defines everything in terms of boxes. A job is a box. Things happen inside the box, and you only need to deal with that.
Mhm.
But you've then got lines between boxes so that when you have an end-to-end process, you know what's coming in, going in the middle and going out. I mean, good old SIPOC, supplier in input, process output,
Mhm.
customer. Um, so you've got all of those for each of one of your boxes. You've got your boxes and your lines. But the glue is something that you need to hold it together while everything's sliding around, while things are changing. And things are always changing. And if you haven't got something that holds it sort of together, when you pull one bit out and put another in, it's all going to go pewing and fly all over the place or collapse in a puddle on the floor. So
Mhm.
the architecture bit is the glue. You
Mhm.
connect to what are we trying to do here? What's the importance? What are we using as success criteria? What are the constraints? So you're defining a range of possibilities that someone can then design in to go down to the next step. And when you're at the next step, architecture is looking back up again. So your architecture actually has to go right down to ground level. It's a way of thinking and looking at the world that is not only going into small boxes,
Mhm.
but how the boxes connect. Does
Mhm.
that help?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's well, that describes things in a
Yeah.
pretty nice way.
Yeah.
And
But the
well,
other one then, to
yeah.
keep on going for a little bit, you talked
Yeah,
about
sure.
other competencies and traits.
Yes.
You're going to need um, you're going to need technical skills, but you're also going to need soft skills. Um, there's a simple
I
phrase
was
that someone says is whatever it is, it's going to be political.
yeah.
You're dealing with the ability to deal with office politics and stupidity and people who
Mhm.
don't get it for 20 years is a real skill that you're going to need. And I'll admit, I'm not wonderful at it. Other people are better at it, and good, because they need to be.
Mhm.
But the other one is a book I'll wave at you, which is a lovely classic called The Art of Scientific Investigation.
Mm-hmm.
And in here, he talks about how science actually works. This is 1950, by the way. He talks about how science actually works as opposed to how people think it works. And science depends on things like the technical skills and the ability to think logically, but logically only works inside the box. You define the premises of your logic, you're
Mm-hmm.
now inside the box. But you've also got to be able to work outside the box. And for that, you're going to need imagination, you're going to need observation, you're going to need intuition, you're going to need to understand the hazards and limitations of reason. You've got to understand how to work with chance. And
Mm-hmm.
if you look at the history of chance, like what's it, Pasteur's phrase, chance favors the prepared mind. So how
Mm-hmm.
do you prepare yourself to allow things to happen?
Mm-hmm.
So those are real skills that we need as well. We need if we think of enterprise architecture or business architecture as a science, then we need the whole of science, not just the logical bits.
Mm-hmm.
The other
And
one is you're going to need technical skills in your own domain. So in business architecture, you're going to need to understand how business models work.
yeah.
You're going to need understand how the law applies in your context. You need to know what the story is that you're connecting to. So what is it that if a value proposition, for example, actually goes both ways, not one way?
Mm-hmm.
What is the value being offered to you in that proposition, as well as you're the value offering to others?
Mm-hmm.
So those kinds of things are the skills that you need to have.
Mm-hmm.
So at the business architecture level, you need that. At the enterprise architecture, the most important skill is being able to stay vaguely sane. Because by definition, you have to cover absolutely everything in the whole organization,
yeah.
for which you are going to need to rely an awful lot on other people, and they will know much more about it than you do. So another really important trait is humility.
Mm-hmm.
To understand and acknowledge that, yeah, you're not the person with the answers, they are. Your job is to connect them together in a way that actually works.
Mm-hmm.
So does that
And what about communication, or more specifically, let's say storytelling skills, Tom? How crucial are they
very
for
much. I
architecture
had forgotten that
practitioners?
bit, but you're entirely right. So often you'll see a description of architecture as being about the structure,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also about the story. And if you think of a building, um, how is this building going to be used? What stories are going to be told here? What is the stage? So often talk about reframing people, process, technology. It's useful to reframe it as actor, scene, and stage. They actually match up quite well. Setting and set, for example. So I've quite often used a toy theatre in workshops to
Mm-hmm.
get people to play model a process. And it shows up very quickly the things that people haven't thought of. Because when you play it for real, then things start coming up. And you can see where the IT can really help and where it will actually be a nuisance
Mm-hmm.
and where you have to rely on the skills of people. Um, so so there's story listening,
Mm-hmm.
story building,
Mm-hmm.
storytelling, and story restructuring.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly when we start getting into the chaos stuff, then the deep stories are the ones that matter. A really good example was, and this is in COVID, one woman I know quite well. She discovered that she was working for a travel agency, a very big multinational one. Discovered they had no CRM. So they now had 20,000 or so customers stranded all over the world. She built a CRM in a hurry because one of the values of the business was that they would always help. And the CRM was to get in contact with people so that they could find them flights home before everything shut down. So understanding the drivers, the principles, the story, what are we telling? And also, if you declare a value and you don't act on it, then you're going to end up with what we call anti-clients,
Mm-hmm.
people who are in the same story but fundamentally disagree with how you're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And these days of social media, they've got a lot more clout than you have. So it's worthwhile sort of looking at it that way as well.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right, a story is really important. And it doesn't need to be fancy. It doesn't need to be the perfect PowerPoint. It's just having a joke.
Short stories,
Starting a
right?
conversation.
Smaller ones. Mhm.
Yeah, but just weaving like a conversation like this is a
Mhm.
story.
Yeah.
We're having a story here with a script or a collection of themes. It's an improv theatre. We're thinking on the spot about how it
Mhm.
works.
Mhm. Okay. Well, Tom, um, I do remember, um, to continue that way, you're
Yeah.
not sort of a big fan of the common layering approach to enterprise architecture. And you touched on this earlier already today. Yeah. So breaking things down into business, application, technology layers. Um, but given that this has long been and still is quite a common approach and practice, if we stick to it at least for a moment, what would you
Mhm.
say? What is sort of the particular role that business architecture, maybe as opposed to other architecture domains, plays in making an impact as an architect out there? What's
Okay,
the relevance
so
of business architecture for practitioners to make an impact with what they do? And as the title of the anthology suggested,
mhm.
increasing the degree of consistency and alignment across the organization.
Well, there's still a large job to convince people that business architecture is about people, is actually about business
Hmm.
rather than just selling IT boxes. But just to jump back, my objection to the layers that you see in most of the classic ones is they don't go too far. So they don't go far enough. Um, there is when I describe what there's a layering model I use called context, scope, plan, action, review. And at the moment, most of what we think of as the layers of business architecture, or particularly of enterprise architecture, they start from about the tail end of scope to about halfway through plan, and that's it. Whereas the architecture needs to reach up into what the heck business are we in? What actually is the scope here? Now we can start talking about the details of how the IT is going to work and all the rest of it, and then actually follow through to how are you going to build it? How is it going to run? How is it going to deal with chaos department? And how are you going to continually learn from what you've done to loop round?
Hmm.
And that's fully fractal. So that operates at every single step in the way. So that's one of the things I've been pushing along recently is the whole point about fractality, that it gives you a means to have some consistency to connect everything together while dealing with the fact that everything's completely different.
Hmm.
So to answer your point about where does business architecture fit? Business architecture is a domain architecture, rather like applications architecture is, like security architecture is. It's a focus theme. And business architecture in particular is focusing on the business of the business. So what are your business models? What are your resource mappings? What are the legal issues you've got to deal with? What are the financial issues you've got to deal with? These are very much in a business architecture domain.
Hmm.
And if you haven't sorted that out, in the same way as if you haven't sorted your security out, then throwing lots of IT at it isn't going to help. In fact, it's likely to make things worse because you
Hmm.
haven't actually thought through what you're trying to do. So, how is this actually going to help? How is this going to work with the big picture story that we have? How is it just going to work with, as I said, for the airport? The airport's business model is fascinating because we think of passengers going through the airport. They aren't customers. They're customers. The customers of the airport are the airlines and the shops. They barely touch people at all, the passengers. So it's a secondary business model. They are the customers of the customers, but it has to look like and feel like that they are customers.
Hmm.
So if you don't get your business architecture sorted out, then a lot of this isn't going to work.
Hmm.
Does that help there?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, great.
So again, on business architecture, Tom, I mean, you've published so many pieces of work
Too
across
many things.
a
Yeah,
wide range of architecture-related topics over the years.
yeah,
But correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, one of your most recent books comes with a dedicated focus on business architecture. Yeah.
yeah.
So the one entitled "Whole Business Architecture."
Yes, which
Exploring the
unfortunately I don't
context of
own. I have a
business
copy of here, so
architecture.
I can't wave it. But
Would
what
would
that
you like
was,
to share a few highlights? What's in the book?
well, the it's a collection. It's right. Start again. My colleague Joseph Chittenden, who is my sort of design person, if you like,
Hmm.
he's been picking up slowly over the years of what I've been trying to say. And what's happening is that we went back to the original weblog, which at the moment is unfortunately offline and will be for quite a while. But so there's about 1,000 articles in there. And so it's a curated collection of thinking, in this case, thinking about business architecture,
Hmm.
but business architecture as business architecture rather than just the bits of IT or bits that might affect IT. So it's about how we're thinking about the role of business in the small scale down to an individual person, in the large scale, as in what impact you're having on the planet, sustainability. I mean, there's a lovely one with Walmart, I remember, where for years they'd been laughing at sustainability activists until someone on the board suddenly realized that if they don't have a sustainable supply chain, they don't have a sustainable business.
Hmm.
And it then became very much in their business interest to talk with sustainable activists to get their supply chain working. And if you look, you'll find a website called walmartsustainability.com, which is their hub for their suppliers to deal with things like um, zero emissions, that kind of stuff, which was going to help people's business models. So there are real practical things about thinking in the bigger picture and then coming back down to how do we make this thing work in small details
Great.
and then come back down again. So you're always connecting through.
Hmm.
So that was a curated set of articles about that. What Joe did was simplify them down, take out my occasional angry rants, because I do get fed up with people who just do not want to get it.
Hmm.
Um, there were some discussions I had, for example, with people who said, this is if you talk about this, you're gonna get fired. And I said, right, here's a real case. I don't know if you know of the United Breaks guitars, that story.
Would you like to share it?
Okay, United Breaks guitars you'll find it on Wikipedia. The
Hmm.
story there was that this was a band, a Canadian from Canada, who were regularly traveling on United. In this case, they were going through to Nebraska for a gig. And in Chicago O'Hare, someone behind them said, "Good heavens, they're throwing guitars out there." And realized that it was their guitars that were being thrown. Sure enough, they were broken. And so they asked United to help pay for the repairs. United gave them a runaround for a year until it really struck him that, yeah, they were never going to do anything with this. So he said, well, what could I do? If I was a filmmaker, I might make a documentary. What am I? I'm just a singer who writes narrative songs. I'll write a narrative song about it. So he did. He wrote this very happy song with a really funny video. I mean, showing, for example, they're sitting on the tarmac with the corpse of the guitar chalked out and someone gently patting him, all the rest. So it's a very funny video. And for the very catchy chorus of we should have flown with someone else. We should have flown by car because United breaks guitars. And he was hoping that over a year he might get as many as 1 million hits. It didn't take a year, 3
Hmm.
days. I saw it on TV on BBC in England. This is from Canada, right? Less than a week later. At that point, United realized they had a really serious PR problem on their hands.
Hmm.
And they rather panicked. And it's estimated that it cost them, well, the direct cost was about 20 million
Wow. Hmm.
to deal with the issue globally. Reputation cost was huge. They also had what we call a pass the grenade problem, which is where everyone started being angry at them for what other airlines had done. So pass the grenade is when the whole industry is doing it, and finally you're the one who's holding it when it goes
Yeah.
bang. And they took a short-term hit on the stock exchange for about 800 million, but it was short-term. So By the way, it was pretty significant. So I said to these people who said that, if you're talking, I'm talking about this is an issue which you think is irrelevant. Are you going to explain to the board that you couldn't be bothered to look at it because it was only going to cost 20 million? So yeah, this is the reason why this stuff matters,
Mhm.
because if you really want to worry the executives, you can point out that they can go to jail for this.
Yeah.
That gets their attention, but you
Yeah.
have to be able to prove that there's a good reason why you've got their attention that way.
That's a very nice story, Tom. Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing this.
So you look it up on Wikipedia or look it
Yeah.
up on YouTube. United Breaks Guitars,
Mhm.
and it's a fun, it's a real classic of bad customer service
Yeah.
design, which is a business architecture issue.
Yeah. Okay. Um, Maybe final question, Tom. You've been trying to push the boundaries of the enterprise architecture discipline, of how enterprise architecture is practiced over so many years. And well, you kind of mentioned this. You've sensed
Mhm.
some frustration along the way
Just a
since
little bit,
things
yes.
did not evolve, did not progress the way you thought it should.
Mhm.
Still, would you say that some progress has been made throughout the
Oh,
years?
yes.
And in addition to this, what might be even more interesting at the very end of this little conversation, how does your vision of enterprise architecture being practiced at some hopefully, let's say, not too distant point in the future, how does it look like with business architecture being an integral part of this?
Well, let's look at business architecture first.
Hmm.
There has been a huge, crucial shift that business architecture is recognized as an element in itself above where it was placed in IT-centric enterprise architecture. We had for quite a while the ridiculous situation where business architecture was framed as being a minor subpart of IT-centric enterprise architecture, but also above it at the same time. And this tended to lead to a lot of confusion. With the drive from things like Osterwalder really was the major shift here. Um, to me, he's too limited, or rather, it's not that it's ideally suited to startups.
Hmm.
It doesn't. You need something else if you're working with not for profits. You certainly need something to think differently about dealing with government issues because they're not about money. The moment you make them about money, you end up in trouble for those. It's also a matter of scale, but it was geared to small to medium startups was what it was for. But it really opened everything to make it accessible. Um, and there's been lots of really nice stuff like the operations canvas at the lower end, dealing with how do you connect from business model canvas down to your operations area. So
Hmm.
we've got some really nice integration happening over the last years. We've also got a breakout far more than before where people are realizing that enterprise architecture actually needs to be about the enterprise. So the framing I use is we build an architecture about an enterprise for an organization, or rather the other way around, we build it for an organization about the big shared enterprise that is its context. Because if you don't understand your context, then you don't know how your business is going to operate. You're going to make lots of really difficult mistakes. So that's what an enterprise architecture is for. It's essentially the context in the same way that your airport is in the enterprise of air travel and air transport. So you've got your freight side, you've got your passenger side, you've got a small mix of both in most passenger airlines, but you've got specifically freight aircraft as well. They're very similar, but they're not the same, and the laws are different. So you need when you've got a multiple way business model, you need to have all of those elements fit together. But they're in the broader enterprise of air travel, which includes legislation, it includes fuel providers, it includes aircraft manufacturers, it includes things like air traffic control. These are all parts of the story which are bigger than or other players in the broader enterprise, but your enterprise, your business won't work without them.
Hmm.
So if you don't understand how they operate and what they need, then by your actions, you can actually screw the pooch, as the phrase goes. You can make a complete mess of everything for everyone else. So that's what I think of as being the enterprise architecture. It's about what is the next step up from where we are.
Mhm.
And so I tend to think in terms of three layers, which is the organization itself, and then
Mhm.
looking inside in to the organization. Then you've got the first level of inside out, which is your customers, suppliers, the direct transactions.
Mhm.
Then you've got the market space, which includes your competitors, where your prospects are coming from, where the journalists are, where the regulators are, where the recruiters are, the trainers are. You're having direct interactions with them, but they're not really transactions in that sense. And then the final level out is the enterprise as a whole, which is that story. So that's and sometimes it's useful to think of that as a kind of outside out. What would it look like if you weren't there?
Mhm.
You're therefore positioning your business into that story. So that's how I view the role of enterprise architecture. The bit that makes it more complicated is you then have enterprises of enterprises of enterprises until you end
Mhm.
up with a planet. Um, and that's some of the issues we're generally looking at. And
Yeah.
also that the tools that we're using for a single business also applies all the way out to a planetary scale.
Mhm.
The bits that connect them together. There are masses of differences, of course, but you still have something where the basic methods work the same way everywhere. So
Mhm.
that's really what my vision is people able to anyone can make a start at it.
Mhm.
Anyone can play, and you the only way you learn, the only way you're going to get there is by dealing with larger and larger scale.
Yeah. Yeah.
In business architecture, they often say that a building architect really only gets into their stride in their 50s because that's about the time when you've actually found how things work painfully. But you start in your 20s
Mhm.
or earlier in some cases. And it's an accretion, a collection, of slowly building experiences and occasionally having interesting collisions with reality department. But that's what you would expect in the development of any skill, which is why I said this brings me back to my starting point, which was the research on how people learn skills.
Mhm.
What I'm doing is applying those same principles to enterprise architecture and business architecture.
Okay, Tom. Um, any other, let's say, final thoughts? Anything you definitely want people to take away from our conversation today?
Yeah, there's one theme I've been really pushing in the new work, which was about power. One of the things is all of this work is relentlessly political in the personal
Mhm.
sense, that it sometimes collides, particularly at the larger scale, it's going to collide with what general politics. But we're talking really about the politics that is the collisions between people. And there's a useful line I've been suggesting, which is about when people talk about power, what we get is a very blurry, indefinite, there is power, and some people have it and some people don't, and we don't really know what it is. So, but there's a way we can simplify the mess. And that was with really two really simple definitions. The physics definition, okay, technically potential, but we'll use it for power. Physics definition is of power is the ability to do work. When you apply that with people, it's doing work as an expression of choice, an expression of responsibility, and so on, but also any kind of work. So digging a ditch is work, but solving a technical problem is work. Finding how to connect people to what the story is in an enterprise is work. All of these things are work. So what is the ability to do that work? And therefore response ability is the ability to choose appropriate responses to something that's going on. But unfortunately, most social definitions of power roughly end up as being power is the ability to avoid work. So there's always a choice. Is power the ability to do it or the power the ability to avoid it? If you're going to do avoiding, then by definition, less and less work gets done.
Mhm.
And trying to offload it onto others or to blame them for it or whatever actually makes things worse. So whenever we're working on business architecture, it is useful to keep that in mind.
Mhm.
What can I do to make it more possible for people to find their own power to do the job? What are we doing which is accidentally disempowering them by stopping them from being able to solve a problem on their own? And we can make a real mess of things if we don't think about that. Or rather, the other way around, we can really push effectiveness by finding ways to remind people that, yeah, they can do this. That's possibly a way to play with it.
And I think that's a very nice way to finish off this conversation today. So thank you very much, Tom. Not
Yeah.
surprisingly, to me, it's been very insightful. Many thanks for this.
Well, thank you as well, because one of the points is that I'm just one crazy old guy out the back end of nowhere. Unfortunately, I've been proven right, and it's taken rather a long time. But for most people, what I talk about is feels a bit crazy at first until you start looking at it in the real world, and then it starts to make sense. But it
It
only
does.
does it when you look at it in the real world.
Yeah.
So
So,
that's what we're after. So thank you for helping me to get the word out and helping this next generation of architects to build this world that might actually be better for once.
yes. So once again, thank you
Yeah.
very much,
Thank
Tom.
you. Yeah, indeed.